Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Biome Podcast with Roby and
Emma. And this week we're going to talk about the reintroduction of the Eurasian brown bear, which is very exciting.
Extremely exciting.
The bears they're incredible. And how do you want to do this? Just have a bit of an overview about bears, Roby, and then we can talk about the possibility of maybe reintroducing them in the UK.
Yeah. Let's do a cheeky overview of the brown bear, which is quite an interesting. Don't we all? Which is quite an interesting species when we talk about it in terms of reintroduction to the UK, in that it hasn't got quite the divisive imagery around it in culture as the wolf. You know, the big bad wolf, the boy who cried wolf. Is it Red Riding Hood or Goldilocks? No, it's Red Riding Hood, isn't it? It's Red Riding Hood with the wolf.
And Goldilocks with the bears.
Goldilocks with the bears, yeah. But what I've always thought is quite interesting with bears is that bears have slightly escaped this demonisation we have of animals in kind of British culture. Not entirely. They get quite a bad thumping in... is it the Bible? I think the Bible quite badly thumps bears. And we've got the whole... Goldilocks going in and troubling the bears. But they're really an interesting species because they're very large, they're quite powerful animals, and there is quite an inherent threat to people and livestock, and yet I think they're quite well suited for reintroduction to the UK at least.
That's interesting you say that, because I think bears is one of those species that would cause quite a few problems, I think, with interactions with wildlife and people. So yeah, I'm curious to see what your argument is for bringing bears back.
Well, it's interesting because I think bears will prove... I don't know. I think wolves get wolves get demonized a lot more, and people tend to think of wolves as the most difficult species to bring back. I almost think that bears might be harder, I think. But anyway, let's just delve into bears. So the Eurasian brown bear has quite an interesting history in the UK. So it wasn't the first bear species in the UK. We had its sister species, the cave bear, which was a very cool Pleistocene bear, absolutely
massive,
huge.
1,000-kilo bear. They're brilliant.
Incredible species. But they went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. And we had Eurasian brown bears, which kind of replaced them as the climate warmed. But we don't quite know a lot about the brown bear's history in the UK. So before the Ice Age, they were quite common. After the Ice Age, populations dwindled, especially in the north, places like Scotland and Wales. They remained quite common in Yorkshire and places like London and the southeast. But after the Stone Age, their numbers declined almost further. And then you've got this fantastic kind of ghost period where you get almost no bear evidence. There's no fossil sites and nothing. Until Roman Britain, where you get skeletons and you get kind of carvings and things made out of bear claws. And what this kind of indicates is that the bears probably went extinct in the early Iron Age and then were brought back by the Romans, who obviously were a big fan of bear baiting and blood sports and all these other weird things you do with wild animals if you're a Roman.
Because it was the massive bear pit kind of... Isn't that where the term comes from? Kind of bear pits where you had fighting bears and things like that. It's in my mind, it blows my mind, honestly. It wasn't that long ago that we were living alongside bears and they were an important part of our culture and our lives. But now, if you said bear to someone in the street, I imagine they'd more associate that with the US, with like grizzlies and not the UK.
And that's a really nice point that you make, because what is the difference between a grizzly bear and a brown bear? So the brown bear is a species complex called Ursus arctos, with a kind of massive range all across Eurasia and North America, and it's split up into lots of different subspecies. So in North America, you've got the grizzly subspecies, the Kodiak subspecies, the Alaskan Peninsula subspecies, the California subspecies, and then in Eurasia, you've got a whole suite of other subspecies. So you've got the Eurasian one, which is the one that we get in, Europe. But then you've got all sorts of nice kind of interesting ones, like the Kamchatkan one, and the Ussuri and Himalayan. Yeah, they're great. They're all kind of like weird little mountain brown bears.
And are these all extant species? Are they ones that are now extinct?
They're all extant. There are a couple which have gone extinct. So the Sitka, Stikine, and Ungava subspecies, as well as the steppe subspecies, have all gone extinct.
Okay.
Largely due to, the usual culprit is us in terms of deforestation and overhunting and encroachment. Yeah. But in Europe, we have the Eurasian brown bear. So the same species as the grizzly, but a different subspecies.
I guess I always thought that grizzlies were more distantly related. I didn't realise that was actually a subspecies of brown bear. I don't know why. I'm not very good with my bear knowledge.
Well, I have to admit, until I was researching for this podcast, neither was I. Because bears are a bit, we don't think about them as much as we think about big cats or wolves. And they're quite, a bit like hyenas. They're quite a kind of narrow lineage. I think there's only, is there 9 species of bear? Can we list all 9 species of bear?
I think it might be 8 or 9.
8 or 9. I think because you've got black, brown, sun, spectacled, polar, Andean. I'm sure there's another. I'm sure there's...
Yeah.
I'm sure we're missing some bears.
I think it's either 8 or 9, I think, species of bear.
Oh, and Himalayan black bear and the panda. Okay, yeah. So there's a cut. There's not many. Is the point? And Ursus is the most prolific genus around at the moment. And in Europe, the brown bears are quite interesting because you've got 3 distinct branches of the family tree. You've got the kind of like the big European branch, and then you've got the 2 tiny Italian and Spanish ones, the Marsican and Cantabrian. Little kind of populations doing their own thing in the peninsulas. And what's interesting is they show very little genetic overlap with their subspecies, sorry.
Because that's an interesting point, because in lots of Europe, you still have bears, and there have been some reintroductions of bears in Europe. If I'm not mistaken, it's most of Europe that does have them.
Yeah. I mean, Poland is doing very well with bears. Quite a few of the Eastern European countries are doing quite well. The Marsican and the Cantabrian are the 2 ones which aren't doing well. Essentially, you've got a kind of a double whammy between habitat deforestation and also genetic isolation. So during the Pleistocene, when the glaciers come down and cover all of Europe, all the European fauna is locked into these tiny little peninsulas, so the Iberian, the Italian, and the Balkans. And they obviously then develop isolated, and their genetics are quite isolated. So the Spanish and Italian bears are quite distinct, and some people say they should be their own subspecies. But then when you then hit them with deforestation and hunting, they just don't have the genes to build up a viable gene pool. So they're doing quite badly. But yeah, do you want to kind of take us through the kind of biology of the brown bear? Because this is obviously something we really need to understand when we talk about bringing them back.
Yeah, absolutely. So with bears, the European brown bear is mostly nocturnal, but you will have it kind of active in the morning and early evening. That tends to be how it is with most wildlife.
It's the only good time to spot them. The amount of times we get stuck out there in the early morning and evening waiting for something to come up.
That is the only time I will wake up early if it's for wildlife. Otherwise, I don't wake up. And, well, yeah, talking of sleeping and not waking up, bears are hibernators, although they're not... What's the deal with hibernating bears? Because is it they go into torpor, which is kind of they just slow down their metabolic rate, or is it true sleep?
I thought it was torpor. I thought it was a kind of very slow down metabolic rate, shut down some of the organs, metabolize all your fats, but I don't think it's... I remember reading a paper and they were like really picky about it, and they were like, no, bears are not true hibernators. And I was like, I'm not getting into this argument. So I think they go into torpor, I think.
Yeah.
I might be wrong.
But I think regardless, it is that stage where they are underground. They kind of really slow down their metabolic rate. They're not eating, they're not feeding really. They'll kind of just stay underground. And I mean, I guess this is true for most bear species as well. They're remarkably intelligent. So they have one of the largest brains of any extant carnivoran relative to their body size. And yeah, interestingly that they've been shown to use tools, which people kind of associate more with like primates or, our own species obviously, but it's not something you'd think about necessarily with bears.
No, and I think that's probably... I can't think of any other carnivorans that use tools. You usually think about it, okay, well, so what is it? It's your elephants, your apes, your monkeys, whales and dolphins, octopuses. But it's quite impressive that bears are on there as well. And I think this intelligence and this curiosity is partly what makes them, I think, probably more troublesome than wolves to reintroduce, and because that feeds into their dietary biology as well, because we are talking about one of the most omnivorous animals on the planet, and it is curious about and will attempt or test to eat almost anything that it comes across.
I think that's when you have issues with people as well, because normally they are quite solitary, they keep to themselves, they don't travel in big groups or anything like that. But if you've got food resources or food waste, rubbish dumps, things like that, that's obviously going to attract bears because, yeah, they'll eat anything.
Yeah.
So I guess that's to their own downfall as well.
I mean, it's quite important to remember that they're not true carnivores. Someone once classified their food preferences as they'll eat whatever is most abundant in the environment. So most of the time that's stuff like berries, grasses, bees, pine cones, mushrooms, roots, fruits, basically anything. And actually most predation attempts are quite badly planned out and most don't succeed. Carrion is what they really go for in terms of meat. And you know, the usual kind of targeting of young and infirm animals if they do come across them.
Yeah. I think that's
really
interesting though, because I think when people think of bears, I don't know about you, but kind of you've got this image of polar bears, which are kind of big meat eaters, like ripping up seals and things like that. Or you've got grizzlies, which is when they're waiting for all the salmon to migrate upstream. Yeah, you wouldn't like. I think bears they have this reputation of being more violent and aggressive than they are when they do. Their diet is, largely kind of like you were saying, berries and seeds and things like that.
Yeah, and obviously now that we can dispel the image of bears being heartless, bloodthirsty carnivores, they do have some really, really, really positive impacts on the environment, and Britain could really benefit from bears coming in and kickstarting these trophic processes again. So, as with any large carnivore, or large omnivore, shall we say, you've got elements of mesopredator control. So if you bring bears back, that'll have a kind of depressing effect on the numbers of foxes and things, which pose quite a threat to lambs and chickens and pets and livestock during the winter months. You've also got a bit of prey management because they will take the odd deer, and so they'll suppress deer numbers, and obviously probably a greater effect of that is creating an ecology of fear. So they reduce the deer over-browsing of areas because they keep the deer moving.
I think that's a fascinating thing about kind of predators and prey, because it's not often something that's talked about. You think of the direct predation and eating of the prey. But like we mentioned in a previous podcast about lynx, it's that same effect of just their presence in the environment changes the behaviour of the prey, which is, very, very cool.
And it just goes to show that you actually don't need an animal to eat loads of deer to change the impact of deer on the environment. Just the mere presence of bears will keep deer moving, which will obviously have a massive impact on our forest and upland ecosystems. And that's the real key point that I think means we need to have bears back, because they have a massive role as seed dispersers. Because obviously you've got this almost half-ton animal sitting there guzzling plants all day, fruits, berries, nuts, roots. The amount of seeds they process and then lay down and spread in their feces is a significant amount. And there's been lots of studies to show that actually a lot of fruit-bearing plants have a mutualistic relationship with the bears. So their seeds are more likely to survive if they're fertilized with bear poo than not with bear poo.
Because I guess that's really awesome. I guess also the way that they feed as well, kind of the way they're foraging, if they are sort of digging up the soil, bringing up tubers and seeds and things like that, that's the same effect as kind of wild boar or things like that, where it would be kind of upturning the soil. And so then what you then get is kind of nutrients that are then able to kind of come to the surface and facilitate plant growth as well.
And the snapping of all those kind of root rhizomes and stuff. I think, is it nitrogen, I think, is the one that people talk about with bears a lot? All that digging kickstarts the nitrogen cycle, I think. And obviously, European brown bears do also feed on all those spawning fish. And they're really cool because there was this great study in, I think it was Oregon. I think it was a study in Oregon, which kind of measured the impact of bears eating all these fish and dragging the bodies on land and leaving them to decay. And they found that I think it was 38% of all the nitrogen in the trees going back 50 meters from the river just comes from these fish which have been brought out. So I think bears are fantastic for their kind of mixing up of all the different nutrient cycles and spreading it all around the forest. I think it's amazing.
And I think just goes to show as well, like we've talked about keystone species a lot in various podcasts, but the idea, it doesn't always have to be kind of an apex carnivore predator that eats loads of meat and controls the food chains in that way. Yes, bears are kind of top of the food chain, but they are able to regulate the environment in so many ways and kind of so many unexpected ways as well, which is one of the awesome things about keystone species.
Yeah, I mean, we're all about keystone species. But I think, the thing with the bears are, unlike the lynx where, there's never been a recorded instance of any fatality to humans and your only potential problem is with livestock. With bears, even though the list of fatalities is incredibly low, so North America only has 2 fatal attacks a year, over, the whole North American continent, only 2 fatal attacks. In Scandinavia, only 4 fatalities since 1902. But we do need to remember that we have, a responsibility to the public and to people who live in the land. Bears are very big and very strong, and if for whatever reason you get on the wrong end of one, they do pose a threat. And I think they probably pose more of a threat than wolves, especially because bears can be habituated easier. Like when they lose their natural cautiousness when attracted to like garbage dumps or food waste places, that's when you get a real problem, I think, with bears. And that needs to be addressed before any reintroduction is brought back in.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think with the UK, there's a challenge as well in the sense that we don't have that many truly wild places left. A lot of it is farmland and a lot of it is kind of publicly owned land, like footpaths and things like that. So it's like, when does it become a very large enclosure and when are they truly wild bears? Because I imagine you'd have issues as well with like dogs and people if they wanted to walk through these areas. People can maybe know how to respond to a bear. If a dog decides to go for a bear, I can place bets on who's going to win that.
Yeah, I pity the Jack Russell that decides to go up against a brown bear. And so, I'm all for rewilding. I'm all for reintroducing species. Personally, I'll be really interested. What do you think? Personally, I don't think bears can be reintroduced on a large scale anywhere across Britain. I don't think we're ready for a self-sustaining breeding population of bears.
I would agree. I think as much as they are incredible landscape regulators, and I think the landscape and the wildlife and just biodiversity could greatly benefit from having bears again, I don't think the UK is ready. Just in terms of, we've got a very, like we've said before, a very kind of zoophobic attitude in Britain, and the amount of opposition there's been to things like the reintroduction of the lynx or the Scottish wildcat, they're small. And they are very small. Like lynx as well, they tend to just go off into the forest. They're not likely to come into contact with people. Bears, I feel there would be more. Yeah. They're intelligent, they're curious, and I worry that there would be a lot of retaliation against anything that happened if there was crops that were destroyed, if someone's dog got killed, if someone was mauled by a bear. They would get massive retaliation against it, which...
But I think that we do have an opportunity here, because the vast majority of aggressive bear encounters occur with mothers and cubs. So that's an issue. So, okay, maybe we start off by saying, okay, we're not going to have any breeding animals. I think we have the capacity, and I think we should go forward with the capacity, for a very small, enclosed and carefully monitored reintroduction. Probably less than 10 bears, because we want to make sure each bear has enough room to live a healthy life. It would need to be in a very isolated, remote area with little arable or what's the other word for it? Arable and livestock farming nearby. So, the cairngorms spring to mind, big empty mountain range. And my kind of suggestion would be just females, because brown bears, we know from studying them, have a very male-biased dispersal. So if you reintroduce a male to an area, he might wander way off. But females have quite localized and quite condensed territories. So my kind of plan, my way of doing it would be, okay, 10 young females. They'll probably stick to one area. They can't breed, so there's probably going to be very few mother protecting cubs scenarios. And they live for about 20 to 30 years in the wild. So this is plenty of time to kind of build up public engagement. If we have them in a kind of controlled area, we can bring people in, say, oh, look at these bears. Look at the brilliant effects they're having on the forest. And so we can have this 10-year trial period of just females to kind of bring people on board, work through all the issues. The bears are enclosed. They can't just wander off. I mean, a nice, big, healthy area. And I think that's got to be the way that we start with bears, because I think we should bring them back. We should. I don't think we can just have a breeding population, which is around 60 individuals now. I don't think we're ready for that.
So do you think then that bears more would serve a purpose of trying to reconnect people to what bears are and kind of what they can do for the environment? Because if you, with the female idea, I can see very little benefit to the bear population as a whole if they're not allowed to breed, if it's not, because say with the reintroduction of the bison, this is something that's coming up, something to look forward to that we're going to talk about.
Look out for bison.
That the idea with that is that over time the herd will grow and it will be managed, but they're allowed to breed. My only worry is that if you're just bringing in females, what good is that doing for the bear population other than human education side of things?
Well, the way I'd kind of look at it is, if you just brought back a load of bears and allowed them to breed in Scotland, there wouldn't be any benefit for the bear population as a whole, because they'd be shot or they'd be hit by cars or you'd have a massive conflict. I would view these 10 females as kind of the ambassadors for their species. So we'd have them in this enclosure. People would come in. People would have a positive interaction with them. They'd see that they're not mindless killers. They're just sitting there eating their mushrooms in peace. And people can come in and they can see the impact that they have on the forest. And after this 10-year trial period where people are on board, I do think we need the animal there to build that engagement. Then we can start releasing. And maybe we've used that 10 years to really kind of iron out where the boundaries of this new national park is going to be or something like that. And then you can bring in the males and then you can start kind of having a native population. But I think you need those kind of ambassadors first before you start a native population again. But that's just my idea. How do you think you would do it if you were in charge of bears?
Oh, now that's a tough question. I don't know. I do agree with you in the sense that it might be good to have bears that are ambassadors for their species rather than, like you said, it won't work if you just do a full-blown reintroduction with breeding bears. That's going to have so much backlash. But I just want to... So we have places in the UK like Bearwood at Wild Place in Bristol, which is kind of a large enclosure, and you have walkways where people can kind of walk over the top of this bear enclosure and you can see them. And I think that has been quite positive in engaging people with bears and their behaviours. Obviously they're captive ones, but I worry that people would be too... it would need to be so controlled if we were to have bears in big enclosures. I reckon you'd have to have things like viewing platforms, which then obviously, how is that different to, say, having them in Wild Place where you can walk over them and you can see them a lot closer? Whereas in the wild, you wouldn't be able to walk in amongst them. I think that would be too dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I just... The trouble is with bears, I just think they're too divisive and they're just too curious and they're too much of a generalist to just release willy-nilly. I just think, and maybe that's the way you do it. Okay, so you cordon off 100 square kilometres of cairngorms with a nice big fence around it and you released 10 females. I don't know if that would work with their bear social dynamics, and then you have these platforms in where you can go and stand and, oh, look, a bear's running past, and you can see the contrast between barren woodland and nice rejuvenated woodland, And it can work. There have been quite successful bear reintroductions. So the Pyrenees, on the border with Spain and France, had quite a successful bear reintroduction. And actually, a lot of the studies done there showed that the bears were mainly nocturnal and avoided peaks of human activity. So human activity has modified their wild behaviour. But this behaviour was actually taught to mothers by the cubs, which kind of is another reason why I think if we start off with females and then 10 years down the line we let them breed, then they'll teach their cubs to be wary of humans, I think. Which is a kind of nice little, we really need to get with the mothers on this one, you know?
Yeah. I think that's the thing with reintroductions, especially in Europe, is I think the UK needs it to happen in other countries first, where there's been success. Because given, how do I put this nicely, the current state of governance of the UK, and just not necessarily, I'm not going to make this political, but just the way that our country is run and is so orientated around farming and kind of a degradation massively of natural habitats. I think, like you say, I would like to believe that it is possible to bring bears back, and I think we could, but we need examples in Europe first where it has worked, and then we also need a shift in attitude from this is something that we're scared of, to kind of creating more wild spaces, and possibly that would allow them to come back. But I don't think we're quite ready yet, unfortunately.
No. But, you know, one can hope, and I think I would hope that in the next maybe 5-10 years we might get to a stage where you think, okay, yeah, a couple of females in the Cairngorms National Park will be fine. Start it off like that. Start small and progress onwards. So shall we wrap up bears there?
Yeah, sounds good. I think that it's a really interesting insight into bears, and it might make people think a little bit about them, and whether maybe in the future that we could possibly have them here in the UK.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to give the brown bear a reintroduction score out of 10. Drum roll. I'm going to give it a 6.
Interesting. I would go lower.
You would go lower? Oh.
Yeah. I was probably going to say like 4 or 5.
Okay. Why?
I just think currently how we are at the moment, I don't think we have the space, the will, or the public acceptance that they could be brought back safely. But possibly 10-20 years down the line, I might bump up my score to like 7. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for listening to this Biome Project podcast. We hope you enjoyed it about brown bears.
So for more information and updates about these podcasts, you can search for the Biome Podcast on YouTube, and then at Biome by Grizzly on Instagram. And then if you want to check our Instagrams out, we have more cool wildlife content.
We go out looking for beavers and otters, and we do all sorts of fun stuff.
We're always up exploring. So we are Emma Hodson Wildlife and Roby Watkinson Wildlife. But yeah, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.